It took Jacob Reynolds less than 10 minutes to hammer a small sign into the ground at the edge of his own land. The letters were simple, black on white, nothing dramatic about them at all. Private property. Do not enter. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at the wooden post standing slightly crooked in the autumn wind. And for a moment he almost smiled, because after everything that had happened over the past few months, this felt like the smallest, quietest act of defiance a man could make on a Tuesday afternoon. By that same afternoon, 3 black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly down the street and stopped in a tight row in front of his house, engines idling like a warning of their own. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle wore a tailored coat despite the mild weather, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been styled that very morning, and she crossed the lawn with the confidence of someone who had never once, in 12 years, been told no. She stood in front of Jacob, in front of the neighbors who had already begun gathering on their porches to watch, and she said, loud enough for everyone on the block to hear, that he was putting up an illegal sign on land that belonged to the homeowners association. 20 minutes later, a single patrol car turned onto the street, lights spinning without sirens, and 2 officers stepped out to ask Jacob Reynolds, calmly but firmly, to step away from the very plot of land that was legally his. He obliged without argument, hands loose at his sides, his expression giving away nothing at all, while behind him the woman in the tailored coat watched with something close to satisfaction settling across her face. Nobody standing on that quiet, tree-lined street that afternoon knew that the silent, unremarkable man they thought they understood had spent 3 full months collecting property records, boundary surveys, and county documents, waiting with the patience of a man who had spent his whole career waiting for concrete to cure. He was waiting for a day exactly like this one, a day that would end not with his humiliation on his own front lawn, but with the slow, methodical collapse of an entire board that had long ago mistaken control for ownership and comfort for permission. Jacob had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, carrying with him 3 decades of work as a structural engineer, decades spent climbing, scaffolding, reading blueprints under fluorescent trailer lights, and helping build other people's dreams before he finally built one of his own. The house was modest by the standards of the street, a single story with a wraparound porch, gray shutters, and a broad maple tree in the front yard that turned a deep, burning orange every October. But to Jacob, it represented something far larger than its square footage or its asking price. It was the proof that a man who had grown up with very little, who had worked double shifts through most of his 20s just to afford night classes, could still end his working life with a piece of earth entirely his own, a place where no supervisor, no client, and no deadline could reach him ever again. He had grown up 2 states away in a rented house that changed twice before he turned 12, and he still remembered, more clearly than he liked to admit, the particular ache of never quite belonging anywhere long enough to plant so much as a single tree of his own. Owning land, real land with a deed bearing his own name, had never felt like an abstract goal to him the way it did for some of his coworkers who spoke of it casually over lunch breaks between projects. It had felt, instead, like the entire point of everything, the quiet destination waiting at the end of 30 years spent measuring other people's foundations, and he intended to defend it with the same careful precision he had once used to certify a building safe for the families who would eventually live inside it. He kept to himself most days, tending his lawn in the early morning before the street fully woke up, nodding politely to neighbors on his way to the mailbox, but rarely stopping to talk beyond a few pleasant words about the weather. Within a few weeks, the general opinion around the cul-de-sac had settled into something simple and slightly unkind, repeated at barbecues and over back fences until it hardened into fact. He was cold, they said, distant, a man who clearly preferred silence to company, a man who never brought anything to the block parties and never lingered long enough to be truly known. None of them ever stopped to consider that some people carry their peace differently than others, quietly, privately, without needing anyone else's approval to feel whole. The neighborhood itself operated under the watchful authority of a homeowners association that had, for nearly 12 years, been run by a woman named Linda Harper, and everyone on that street understood, whether they said it aloud or not, that Linda was the true and unquestioned power in the community. She had built her reputation slowly, one committee position at a time, chairing the landscaping subcommittee before moving to treasurer and finally to president, until she occupied the role with the kind of permanence usually reserved for monarchs rather than volunteers. In all those 12 years, not a single resident had successfully challenged her on anything of real consequence, and those who tried quickly discovered that resistance only invited more scrutiny, more letters, more unannounced visits from association representatives carrying clipboards. Linda loved rules the way some people love money, not for what they accomplished in practice, but for the leverage they provided in every conversation, every meeting, every quiet threat disguised as friendly reminder. She had discovered early on, almost by accident, that most homeowners would rather comply with an unreasonable demand than risk the social and financial consequences of resisting her, the fines, the gossip, the subtle exclusion from neighborhood events that followed anyone who dared push back. Her authority had been subtle at first, a letter here, a warning there, delivered always with a smile and a reminder that these rules existed for everyone's benefit. But over 12 years it had calcified into something closer to a personal fiefdom, and Linda Harper had grown so accustomed to obedience that she no longer recognized the difference between enforcing a bylaw and simply exercising power for its own sake, because to her they had become the same thing entirely. She had come to the neighborhood long before most of the current residents, back when the subdivision was still half built and the road still smelled faintly of fresh asphalt, and in some private corner of her mind she had come to see the entire street as an extension of her own household, something she alone was responsible for shaping. Newer neighbors like Jacob, arriving with their own histories and their own quiet certainties about what belonged to them, struck her less as fellow homeowners and more as unfinished projects waiting for her guidance, whether they realized they needed it or not. It never once occurred to her, in all those years, that the very confidence which made her so effective at running committee meetings might one day become the exact thing that unraveled her, because confidence unchecked by any real accountability rarely recognizes its own limits until it has already gone too far to reverse course quietly. The letters from the Homeowners Association began arriving in Jacob's mailbox within his first few months of ownership, and at first they seemed almost reasonable, the kind of small administrative nitpicking that every new resident expected to encounter somewhere along the way. One letter claimed his fence was painted the wrong shade of white, off by some fraction of a tone that only a trained eye could possibly detect. Another insisted his grass had grown beyond the permitted height by less than an inch, measured, apparently, during a drive-by inspection he had never been informed of. A third informed him that his trash bins were positioned incorrectly along the curb, angled a few degrees off from the association's preferred orientation, and a fourth demanded he replace his mailbox with a specific approved model, sold only through a vendor the association happened to have a relationship with. Jacob, wanting nothing more than a quiet life after decades of noise and deadlines, corrected every single infraction without complaint, repainting the fence on a Saturday afternoon, trimming the grass an extra half-inch shorter than required just to be safe, repositioning the bins exactly as instructed down to the angle. He believed, in those OS.A and OS they would eventually leave him alone entirely. But peace was never really the goal of these letters, not fundamentally, and as the months passed, the demands grew stranger and more invasive, no longer content with simple corrections to visible, external property that any passerby might notice. Association representatives began appearing on Jacob's land without any warning at all, walking directly onto his lawn with measuring tapes and clipboards, as though the grass beneath their feet already belonged to them rather than to him. They photographed the corners of his property from odd angles, jotted numbers into small notebooks, and left without so much as a knock at his door, or a single word of explanation offered to the man watching quietly through his kitchen window. When Jacob finally asked one of them, calmly and directly, what exactly they were measuring, and under what authority, he received only a vague mention of compliance standards before the man simply turned and walked back toward his truck, as though the question itself had been an inconvenience. It happened again the following month, and then again after that, each visit slightly bolder than the last, each one leaving Jacob with a quiet unease that had nothing to do with fences or grass length, and everything to do with boundaries being tested in ways he could not yet fully explain to himself. He noticed, too, that the measurements always seemed to extend a little further onto his land than the last time, small increments that might have been mistaken for error if they hadn't been so consistent, so deliberate in their creeping direction. He kept his composure through all of it, because that had always been his instinct, to absorb friction rather than manufacture it, to let quiet observation do the work that confrontation never could. But somewhere beneath that calm exterior, a slow and careful attention had already begun to take root. The same instinct that had once told him a support beam was about to fail long before anyone else noticed the first hairline crack. After the fourth unannounced visit to his land, Jacob made a decision that would ultimately reshape the entire street, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than a modest, entirely reasonable act of self-protection. He drove to the local hardware store one Saturday morning and purchased a simple wooden post along with a metal sign, the kind sold in any hardware store across the country for a few dollars. Nothing special or provocative about it at all. He planted it firmly at the edge of his property where the association representatives had been walking through without permission, choosing the exact spot where their footprints had worn a faint path into the grass over the preceding weeks. The words were direct and impossible to misread from any distance. Private property. No trespassing. Cameras recording. He installed a small weatherproof camera beside the post that same afternoon, angled carefully to capture the exact stretch of land the association had been treating as its own personal walkway for months. He went to bed that night believing, perhaps a little naively given everything he already suspected, that a clearly marked boundary would finally put an end to the intrusions once and for all. By the following morning, however, word of the sign had already reached Linda Harper through the neighborhood's informal but remarkably efficient grapevine, carried by a landscaping subcontractor who happened to drive past and mention it to another resident on his route. Her reaction, when it came, was immediate and wildly disproportionate to anything the situation actually called for, a fact that struck several board members as odd even as they went along with it out of habit and long-standing loyalty. Linda called an emergency meeting of the association board before the sun had even fully risen over the neighborhood, pulling 3 committee members away from their morning coffee with a tone of voice reserved for genuine emergencies. By mid-morning, she stood before this small, hastily assembled gathering, describing Jacob Reynolds in terms that made him sound less like a private homeowner exercising ordinary rights and more like an active threat to the entire community's way of life. "He is defying the community," she told them, her voice sharp with a righteousness she had rehearsed many times before, though never against someone quite this quiet, quite this unbothered by her usual theatrics. She framed his simple wooden sign as an act of open rebellion against the shared values of the neighborhood, insisting that if this behavior went unanswered, other residents might feel emboldened to follow his example. And where, she asked the room, would that leave any of them? Within hours, whispers had already begun moving from porch to porch, from mailbox to mailbox, carried by neighbors who had never spoken more than a passing greeting to Jacob, but were now suddenly convinced he was some kind of problem resident lurking quietly among them. Someone mentioned, without any real evidence, that he might be planning to build something without permits. Someone else speculated that he had always seemed a little too private, too guarded, the kind of man you had to watch. Jacob heard the murmurs, of course, because sound travels easily on a quiet suburban street where every conversation carries twice as far as intended, but he said nothing in response, choosing instead to water his garden and go about his mornings exactly as he always had, giving the gossip nothing new to feed on, and nobody the satisfaction of a reaction. Linda arrived at Jacob's property 2 days later with 3 other members of the association trailing behind her in a loose formation, all of them moving with the practiced confidence of people who had never once faced real resistance in their lives on this particular street. She stopped directly in front of the sign, studied it for a long, deliberate moment, as though reading a legal document rather than 4 short lines of text, and then pointed one manicured finger at the post as though it were physical evidence in a courtroom. "That sign is standing on association land," she announced, loud enough for the neighbors already gathering on their porches and driveways to hear every single word clearly across the still autumn air. Jacob answered simply, without raising his voice at all, saying only that the land in question belonged to him according to every record he had ever seen, and that he had every legal right to mark its boundary however he chose. Linda let out a short, dismissive laugh, the kind reserved for people she believed had no idea who they were dealing with, no understanding of how these things actually worked in her neighborhood, and told him flatly that he was encroaching on shared property that belonged to every resident collectively. She demanded, in front of everyone now watching from a respectful but attentive distance, that he remove the sign immediately or face consequences he would not enjoy in the slightest, consequences she left deliberately vague and therefore all the more unsettling. Jacob refused, calmly and without hesitation, standing his ground in a way that clearly caught Linda off guard, since very few residents in 12 years had ever told her no to her face without eventually backing down under pressure. She had expected the usual pattern to play out, a quiet apology, followed by immediate compliance, the same dance she had performed successfully with dozens of homeowners over the years who valued their standing in the community more than a small patch of grass. But Jacob simply repeated, word for word, that the land was his and the sign would remain exactly where it stood, his voice never once rising above a conversational tone, even as the small crowd around them grew slightly larger. Her expression shifted from irritation to something colder and more calculated, a flicker of genuine anger crossing her features before she composed herself again, and she pulled her phone from her coat pocket without another word of warning to anyone present. Within minutes, she was on the line with local police, describing the situation in language carefully chosen to sound urgent and serious, framing a wooden sign on private land as though it were an act of vandalism against shared community property that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Jacob watched her make the call, arms crossed loosely, saying nothing at all, already sensing that this moment, however uncomfortable and however publicly staged, was simply one more step in a sequence he had anticipated for quite some time now. He glanced briefly at his camera, its small red light blinking steadily beside the sign, and felt, for the first time in months, something close to relief rather than dread. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, stepping out of their patrol car with the practiced neutrality of people who had responded to countless neighborhood disputes before and fully expected this one to be equally mundane and quickly resolved. Linda wasted no time presenting her case, producing a thick folder of documents that included an association map, an outdated property sketch clearly photocopied many times over the years, and a heavy binder of internal community bylaws, all of which she flipped through with theatrical urgency, as though the paperwork alone proved her ownership of the disputed patch of grass. Jacob, in contrast, remained perfectly composed, reaching into his own jacket pocket and producing a single clean document, the official deed to his property, stamped and recorded by the county itself with a raised seal that caught the afternoon light. Linda barely glanced at it before declaring, with total confidence and not a trace of doubt in her voice, that the papers were most likely falsified, a claim so bold that even one of the officers raised an eyebrow in quiet surprise at the accusation. The other officer asked to see both sets of documents side by side, comparing them slowly while the small crowd of neighbors watched in an uncomfortable silence that had replaced their earlier gossip entirely. Neither officer was a land surveyor, of course, and neither felt qualified to resolve a dispute this specific on the spot, and so, after a brief and quiet consultation between the two of them, they instructed both parties to maintain the current state of the property until the matter could be properly reviewed through official channels. Linda appeared visibly satisfied by this outcome, convinced she had once again won simply by being louder, more prepared, and more forceful than her opponent, and she thanked the officers warmly before walking back to her car, with her small entourage trailing behind her. What none of them realized, standing there on that windswept lawn scattered with fallen maple leaves, was that Jacob Reynolds had already spent months preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, long before the sign had ever gone into the ground at all. Several months earlier, while reviewing his own closing documents out of simple habit during a quiet weekend, Jacob had noticed a small discrepancy between his recorded property lines and the boundaries the association had been quietly enforcing across the neighborhood for years. Curious, rather than alarmed at first, he had submitted a request to the county recorder's office for copies of the original plat maps, and what he found there troubled him far more deeply than any argument over grass length or mailbox styles ever could have managed on their own. The association's internal survey documents, it turned out, had been quietly altered at some point over the years, shifting boundary lines by small but meaningful margins across multiple lots on the street, expanding what the association claimed as shared common land at the direct expense of individual homeowners who had no idea their property had shrunk on paper. This expanded common land, Jacob came to understand after weeks of careful comparison, could later be used to justify additional maintenance fees, expanded enforcement authority, and tighter restrictions across dozens of properties throughout the neighborhood, all under the guise of protecting shared community assets that had, according to the county's own original records, never actually existed in the first place. Jacob, being a man who had spent his entire career reading blueprints and identifying structural flaws long before they became visible cracks in a finished building, understood almost immediately that this was not a simple clerical error, but a deliberate pattern repeated across multiple lots with a consistency that no honest mistake could ever produce. Rather than confronting Linda directly, which he suspected would only prompt her to quietly destroy or bury the relevant evidence before anyone else could review it, he chose the slower, more methodical path his engineering training had instilled in him over decades of careful, patient work. He requested and downloaded the complete county property records for the entire subdivision, an evening's worth of tedious digital paperwork that most people would have abandoned within the first hour, and cross-referenced every single parcel against the association's internal maps one by one, marking each discrepancy on a spreadsheet he kept backed up in 3 separate locations. He hired an independent licensed surveyor from 2 counties over, a professional with no ties whatsoever to the local homeowners association or any of its members, to walk his property line and confirm precisely where his land actually began and ended, according to official, verifiable county measurements rather than internal association documents of questionable origin. And quietly, without ever mentioning a single word of it to any neighbor, he began recording every unauthorized visit the association made onto his land, building a time-stamped digital archive of exactly the kind of behavior Linda had just demonstrated so confidently in front of 2 police officers earlier that same day. Every clipboard, every measuring tape, Every unexplained photograph taken without his permission became another entry in a growing record that he stored securely, far beyond the reach of anyone who might wish to see it disappear before it could ever be used. He did not know, in those early months, exactly how or when this evidence would matter. Only that a man who had spent his life reading the early signs of structural failure understood, instinctively, that patterns like this one never simply resolved themselves without intervention. Emboldened by what she believed was a decisive victory over an isolated and stubborn homeowner, Linda made the mistake that would ultimately unravel everything she had built over 12 careful years of quiet control across the neighborhood. In the weeks following the police visit, she authorized association workers to return to Jacob's property once more, this time with clearer instructions, and considerably less caution than they had shown before, since the earlier police involvement had, in her mind, already validated her authority. Association workers removed his sign entirely one afternoon while he was away running errands at the hardware store, tossing it carelessly into the bed of a pickup truck, as though it were nothing more than roadside debris left over from someone else's project. On another occasion, just a week later, workers walked directly across his lawn in broad daylight to drive metal survey stakes into the ground, marking lines that matched the association's altered internal maps rather than the county's official, publicly available records. They worked with the casual confidence of people who believed no one was watching closely enough to matter, laughing between themselves as they measured and staked, entirely unaware of the small camera quietly capturing every angle of what they were doing from its discreet position beside the mailbox post. Every single one of these incidents was captured in full, clear detail, time-stamped and preserved on a secure external drive, far from any location the association could ever access or interfere with, a growing collection of footage that Jacob reviewed each evening with the same careful, unhurried attention he had once given to structural inspection reports. Jacob made no attempt to stop any of it as it happened, standing quietly at his window or working in his garage while association workers trespassed openly across his land yet again, because he understood, with the patience of a man who had spent decades waiting for concrete to cure and steel beams to settle into place, that resistance in the moment would accomplish far less than careful documentation would later accomplish in front of an audience that mattered. His attorney, a sharp and understated woman named Karen Whitfield, whom he had quietly retained months earlier after his first suspicions took shape, reviewed each new piece of footage as it arrived, cataloging it alongside the surveyor's report and the county records he had already gathered. After the survey stakes incident, watching the footage a second time in her small downtown office, she finally allowed herself a small, satisfied smile across her desk, closing the folder in front of her with quiet finality. "Enough," she told him simply, setting her pen down. It was time, she explained, to stop collecting evidence and start using it. Because the pattern of behavior was now so clear, so well documented, and so thoroughly corroborated by independent sources that no board, no matter how confident or how long entrenched, could possibly survive what was coming for them. The scheduled hearing before the full Homeowners Association drew a larger crowd than the community had seen in years, residents packing into the small meeting hall, with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for far more dramatic occasions than a simple property line dispute between two neighbors. Folding chairs had to be brought in from a nearby storage closet to accommodate everyone, and several people stood along the back wall, coffee cups in hand, murmuring to one another about what exactly they expected to happen that evening. Linda arrived early, composed and confident as always, greeting board members with the easy familiarity of someone who had already decided, well in advance, how the evening would inevitably end in her favor. She had spent 12 years watching residents fold under pressure in rooms exactly like this one, and she saw no reason whatsoever to expect anything different from the quiet, unassuming engineer who had caused her so much recent inconvenience over what still seemed, to her, like a trivial matter of a few square feet of grass. Jacob arrived without fanfare, carrying only a laptop bag and a small folder of printed documents, taking a seat near the front of the room without acknowledging the whispers that followed him in. When his turn came to speak, he did not raise his voice or offer a single dramatic flourish, choosing instead to simply connect his laptop to the association's projector and let the evidence do whatever talking needed to be done on his behalf. The footage began with the earliest recorded intrusion, grainy but entirely unmistakable, showing association workers walking across Jacob's lawn months before the sign had ever gone up at all, well before this dispute had even become public knowledge on the street. It continued through dozens of similar clips, each one clearly time-stamped, each one showing measuring tapes, clipboards, and metal survey stakes being driven into ground that belonged, according to every official county record now displayed alongside the video on the projector screen, entirely and unambiguously to Jacob Reynolds. He followed the video footage with a series of photographs documenting each visit, then with printed copies of internal emails exchanged between association members discussing boundary adjustments in language that left very little room for innocent interpretation. Finally, he displayed the original county plat maps, laid side by side with the association's own internal survey documents. The discrepancies between them projected large enough for even the residents standing along the back wall to see clearly for themselves. A licensed county land surveyor, whom Jacob's attorney had formally invited to attend the hearing as an independent expert witness, stood before the room and confirmed, in plain and thoroughly unambiguous language, that Jacob's property boundary was exactly where the official county records placed it, and that the association's internal maps had been demonstrably altered from the county's original documentation at some point in the past. The mood in the room shifted so completely and so suddenly that Linda, for the first time and longer than anyone present could actually remember, found herself sitting in total silence, unable to summon an immediate rebuttal to any of it. Board members who had nodded along with her for years exchanged uncertain glances with one another, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the implications of what they were seeing began to settle in. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not the gossip and speculation of weeks past, but something closer to genuine shock, the sound of people realizing all at once that the ground beneath their assumptions had just been pulled out from under them entirely. One board member, a quiet man near the back who rarely spoke during meetings, finally raised his hand and asked, in a voice that carried further than he probably intended, how long this had actually been going on, and whether the board itself had ever approved any of the boundary changes shown on the screen. Linda opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, and for the first time that evening she seemed to understand that the room was no longer hers to control, simply by speaking with enough certainty. After the hearing ended that night, residents lingered in the parking lot far longer than usual, clustering in small groups beneath the streetlights to discuss what they had just witnessed inside. Someone asked aloud whether this meant the fees they had been paying for years toward the so-called common garden strip behind the cul-de-sac might finally be refunded, and someone else wondered quietly whether the fence height rule that had cost her $400 in fines 3 years earlier had ever been legitimate in the first place. Jacob packed up his laptop without joining any of these conversations, though he noticed, walking to his car, that several people who had barely acknowledged him in 2 years now nodded at him with something that looked distinctly like respect rather than suspicion. Word of the hearing reached the county's oversight office within days, carried there by a formal complaint Jacob's attorney had already prepared and filed the very next morning while the story was still fresh. What followed was an investigation far more thorough and far more damaging to the association than anyone in the neighborhood had initially anticipated when the evening's hearing first concluded. Inspectors from the county combed through years of association records, financial statements, and board meeting minutes, and discovered that the altered survey maps were only the very beginning of a much larger and more troubling pattern of misconduct, stretching back nearly a decade into the association's history. Meeting minutes, investigators found, had been quietly rewritten on multiple occasions to remove objections raised by residents who had long since moved away or simply given up fighting after years of exhausting resistance. Fees had been collected from homeowners under justifications tied directly to the falsified boundary lines, money taken for the maintenance of common areas that, according to the county's actual, unaltered records, had never belonged to the association in the first place. Property rights across numerous lots on the street had been systematically compromised for years without most residents ever fully understanding why their available land seemed to shrink slightly every time the association updated its maps. All of it now traced back through documentation Jacob had spent months quietly assembling in near total secrecy. As these details became public, spreading quickly through a neighborhood that had once relied on Linda's version of events for nearly everything, something remarkable happened that surprised even Jacob, who had privately expected only vindication for himself and little else beyond that. One resident after another began coming forward with stories of their own, quiet confessions of pressure they had endured from Linda over the years but had never once dared to voice aloud for fear of retaliation or exclusion. A woman named Patricia, who lived 2 houses down from Jacob, described being forced to pay for landscaping changes she never wanted or requested, threatened repeatedly with fines she genuinely could not afford to challenge on her fixed income. An older man near the end of the street, a retired schoolteacher named Robert, admitted publicly that he had sold his home years earlier, partly to escape the constant scrutiny and unreasonable demands that had made ordinary daily life feel increasingly impossible under Linda's rigid oversight. For the first time in 12 years, Linda Harper stood before her own board without a ready answer prepared. Her composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of testimony she could no longer easily dismiss or spin to her advantage. The board, faced with mounting documented evidence and a growing chorus of residents demanding real accountability at last, called an emergency vote that same evening and suspended her from her position, pending the outcome of the ongoing county investigation. Several board members who had served alongside her for years now distanced themselves quickly and publicly, releasing statements expressing regret over practices they claimed they had never fully understood or endorsed, though residents privately wondered how much they truly hadn't known. The formal investigation concluded several weeks later, and its findings left little room whatsoever for interpretation or leniency toward anyone involved in the years of misconduct it uncovered. Linda Harper resigned from every position she held within the association, a resignation that arrived not as a graceful, dignified exit, but as an inevitability she could no longer avoid or delay any further. She faced a civil lawsuit brought jointly by Jacob and several other residents whose property rights had been quietly eroded over the years, a legal process that would take many months to fully resolve but left no genuine doubt about where the fault for the situation truly lay. The association itself was compelled by county order to issue a public apology to the entire community, a formal, written acknowledgement of years of overreach that many residents had quietly suffered through in silence, without ever realizing others were experiencing the exact same pressure. It paid direct financial compensation to Jacob for the repeated unauthorized intrusions onto his land, and it was legally forced to revoke a long list of internal rules and fee structures that county investigators determined had never carried any legitimate legal authority in the first place. New elections were scheduled for the board, and residents who had never before considered attending a single association meeting suddenly found themselves eager to participate in shaping whatever came next for their community. The county attorney's office also recommended, as part of its final report, that the association adopt independent third-party audits of its financial records every 2 years going forward, a suggestion the newly reconstituted board adopted unanimously at its very first meeting, without a single dissenting voice. A handful of residents proposed renaming the small stretch of disputed common land after the investigation itself, half joking, half serious, as a permanent reminder of what had nearly gone unnoticed for a decade. Others simply wanted the whole matter behind them, eager to return to ordinary conversations about landscaping and holiday decorations rather than legal filings and county inspectors. And slowly, over the following months, the neighborhood did begin to settle back into something resembling its old rhythm, only quieter now, and considerably more careful about where authority actually came from. The neighbors who had once whispered about Jacob's coldness now found themselves approaching him quite differently in the weeks that followed, some stopping by his porch simply to apologize sincerely for judgments they had made, without ever understanding the quiet, patient battle he had been fighting on their behalf every bit as much as his own. Patricia brought over a homemade pie one Sunday afternoon, sitting on his porch steps for nearly an hour, explaining how relieved she felt now that the constant threat of fines had finally lifted from her shoulders. Robert, the retired schoolteacher, mentioned that he was reconsidering his decision to sell his old house nearby, now that the neighborhood finally seemed like a place worth returning to. Jacob accepted these apologies graciously but without much ceremony or fanfare, because he had never wanted to become the center of the neighborhood's attention, and he certainly had never set out one morning to be anyone's hero when he first hammered that simple wooden post into the ground. All he had ever wanted was the simple, uncomplicated peace of living quietly on a piece of land he had spent an entire working life earning through decades of scaffolding, blueprints, and long hours, free from the kind of quiet, creeping control that had slowly tightened around his neighbors for over a decade without most of them ever fully realizing it was even happening to them. He had simply refused, in his own quiet and methodical way, to let that same control tighten around him too, and in refusing so patiently, so carefully, and so thoroughly, he had ended up freeing far more than just the boundaries of his own front yard. On a cool afternoon, several weeks after the investigation had formally closed, Jacob walked out to the edge of his property, carrying the same small wooden post he had planted months earlier, now slightly weathered from the season but otherwise entirely unchanged in its message. He set it back into the ground exactly where it had always stood, tapping it firm with the flat side of a hammer, while the late autumn light spread gold and deep orange across the fallen leaves, scattered thickly around his feet and along the quiet street beyond. The words on the sign remained exactly as they had always been, simple and direct, asking nothing more than the basic respect any person deserves for the boundaries of what genuinely belongs to them. Private property. Please respect the property line. He stood back for a long, quiet moment, looking at it the way he might have once studied the final support beam settling into place on a building he had helped design decades earlier, satisfied not because he had won some grand and public battle in front of an audience, but because the quiet, uncomplicated order he had always wanted for himself had finally, truly returned to his small corner of the world. Down the street, a neighbor waved at him from a porch, and he lifted his hand in return, something he rarely used to do before all of this began. The maple tree above him let go of another handful of leaves, carried gently by the wind across the lawn he had fought so quietly and so thoroughly to keep. And on that street, in the fading amber light of an autumn afternoon, nobody dared to cross that line again.